Okay, now I'm going to introduce you to Ben Blake. I talked with him a year ago about his grandfather, and it's an incredible story. Not many of us that I know of have really been able to hear a life story about someone who survived the Choisin Reservoir. It's an incredible story. So he's here today. He is a Marine Corps veteran himself. Come on up. He served 4 years as a rifleman with the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines. He is now the education coordinator for the Veterans Upward Bound project in the Treasure Valley. He brought a number of his cohorts with him. These are all of his, the people that work with him on the different projects around this organization. He's going to speak today about his grandfather, retired U.S. Army Colonel Bob Rosen, who served for 30 years. He enlisted in 1942, he attended West Point, and in the winter of 1950, he was sent to North Korea. Within 6 weeks, he was in command of a platoon that would be a part of one of the most intense battles in U.S. military history, the Choisin Reservoir campaign. Let me introduce to you now. Well, here's Ben.
I'm going to use my notes. Thank you all for having me. I've gotten to talk a little bit about my grandfather over the years, but never to this extent and to such a large audience, so I appreciate this opportunity. My grandfather was born in Manhattan in 1925. He was the oldest of 2 kids. He grew up during the Depression. As I was told as a kid, they didn't always have a lot, but apparently chocolate cake was always readily available, which probably speaks to the love of that in our family. In December of '42, he graduated high school, and I misspoke to Sue. He enlisted in March of '43. He would go to Camp Blanding, Florida for basic training, where they would form the 66th Infantry Division. It was here that he saw a letter on his CO's desk for taking a test to get into West Point. It was this point that the family lesson of learning to be able to read upside down became quite critical. When asked by my uncle why he enlisted to get to West Point, my grandfather would say, because there was no way an Irish Catholic congressman from Brooklyn was going to appoint a Jewish kid to West Point. He applied to the West Point Prep School program in the summer of '43, and he got schooling from the University of Pittsburgh and the University of Massachusetts Amherst, before finally being accepted to West Point, where he would start in the summer of 1944. This is special for a couple of reasons. One being, this was the last of the 3-year classes. So during World War II, the service academies, at the time just West Point and Annapolis, were condensing their classes to just 3 years to expedite the process of producing new officers for the U.S. military. So his class, having made it through the first year, would get split in half. His half graduated in '47 in 3 years, and the other half of his class got extended out to 4 years. This is also a special thing to us and my family because the transports that were carrying members of the 66th Infantry Division that he had originally enlisted into, several of them would be sunk off the coast of France in December 1944, and so without him being at West Point, we're not sure where he would have ended up. He ended up being in the class with the 2nd highest percentage of Jewish students, interestingly enough. The only class with a higher percentage was the 1st class. There were 2 students who graduated. One of them was Jewish. In the spring of '45, he ended up in the company of cadets that was tasked with being in the funeral procession for FDR. He would graduate in '47 as a civil engineer, and he went on into the Army's Corps of Engineers. Just a few of the pictures of him at West Point. His first duty station would be at Fort Leonard Wood for the Army's engineering school. After this, he would spend time at Fort Belvoir in Virginia, and then on to Fort Stewart in Georgia, which was home of the 3rd Infantry Division, and then Guam, and eventually on to Japan, which was at the time also housing a good chunk of the 3rd Infantry Division for the post-war occupation. In June 25th, 1950, North Korean military, the Korean People's Army, crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea, pushing UN forces south to Pusan. The map on the left here indicates slowly the progression they made southward towards the Pusan perimeter, which is indicated in green. Each line representing the further progression south they made as the North Korean army pushed them south. MacArthur facilitated the landing at Incheon on September 15th, utilizing the 1st Marine Division, which several people have mentioned membership of here this morning. The landing at Incheon would successfully allow for the breakout from the Pusan perimeter the next day, and by September 25th, UN forces had successfully recaptured Seoul. By October of 1950, the UN had moved their forces north of the 38th parallel, which is now the dividing line between North and South Korea. The amphibious landing of X-Corps at Wonsan and an airborne drop in conjunction with assaults by the British and Australians led to a rapid advance north during late October and into early November. My grandfather at this time would be assigned to Dog Company, 10th Engineer Combat Battalion, 3rd Infantry Division, which would be one of the last units ashore at Wonsan on November 20th, 1950, having just arrived from Japan. Dog Company would spend the next week ashore getting organized for operations. Awesome, thank you. See here the pictures of the landing at Wonsan, which is a large amphibious operation, though not nearly as large as Incheon or the operations we saw during World War II. Slide, please. This is the only picture we have of my grandfather in Korea. It was taken just before his arrival at Choisin Reservoir at the end of November 1950. And this is him with his Jeep and the winter clothing he was issued at the time. On November 27th, Dog Company was detached from 3rd Infantry Division and was attached to the 185th Engineer Combat Battalion to build the command post for X-Corps. At the time, the tactical situation was briefed as, quote, perfectly secure. The Battalion XO from the 185th had just returned in his own Jeep, and Marines were making the drive to and from the reservoir freely with their headlights. The company reached the town of Hamhung with all of their equipment except for their bulldozer, where they refueled and finished their last 50 miles to the town of Hagaruri. During their movement, Marine artillery could be heard in the distance, leading to a concern about the security of the area. Dog Company would finally reach their bivouac site just south of Hagaruri around 0200 on the 28th, where they posted security and proceeded to bed down for the night. 5 of their trucks, along with an officer and 20 men, failed to arrive due to engine problems and couldn't catch up before the road south would be closed by the enemy troops. Having only been in Korea for a week, they had not had ample time to acclimate to the weather. Their heavy winter clothing was less than helpful, and they experienced a temperature drop of 20 degrees above zero to about 15 degrees below during their 150-mile journey inland. My grandfather would later describe utilizing sandbags to keep his shoes and feet warm, as at the time the winter issue boots were, we'll say, less than effective, and if anything would cause your feet to sweat a great deal, and then that would freeze, and you'd end up with just as many problems as having not used them. So instead, he chose to take burlap sandbags and wrap his boots. My grandmother, who was an extremely intelligent woman, often believed that he meant he had placed full sandbags around his feet. I'll let you picture that image. Slide. So by the 28th of November, this is the rough disposition of Allied forces around the reservoir. So on the west side was the 5th Marine Regiment and 7th Marine Regiment of the 1st Marine Division. Just south of that was, at the very bottom, you can see the town of Hagaruri, where a portion of 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment was posted, along with my grandfather's company and a great deal of support units. The balance of 1st Marine Regiment would be further south of the town of Kodori, along with Chesty Polar's headquarters. The east side of the reservoir was almost exclusively occupied by the U.S. Army, made up primarily of the 31st and 32nd Infantry Regiments, later named Task Force Faith for their commander, Colonel Don Faith. At 0900 on the 28th, the company was roused, and while breakfast was being prepared, a local civilian alerted them to an enemy presence on the road nearby. A patrol was sent out to investigate. At around this same time, a Marine major and his driver walked into the camp having been stopped by an enemy roadblock just a mile away. My grandfather Bob and the CO of his company organized a platoon to investigate, but quickly encountered heavy fire from an entrenched enemy. The platoon withdrew, having been informed that the Marines were sending a patrol to handle the situation. The company proceeded to spend the rest of the morning digging in while cycling their troops through chow and preparing to begin construction for that command post. At 1400 on the 28th, the G2 of the 1st Marine Division, so their intelligence officer, arrived at the company command post, likely surprised that they were still preparing materials for the construction of the X-Corps CP. He informed them that Hagaruri was now surrounded and that they should expect heavy attacks throughout the night. As the perimeter was thinly guarded, Dog Company was asked to take a portion of the lines, occupying prepared positions on East Hill. It was only 300 yards from their current position, but almost 300 feet straight up the hill. On their left, they would tie in with a platoon from the 4th Signal Battalion from the Army, and on their right, they would be anchored on a steep slope which overlooked a roadblock position occupied by Marines of Weapons Company 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine. At the time, a sense of urgency hadn't developed as the gravity of the situation had not set in. The company moved its vehicles and equipment inside the perimeter to a Marine equipment park, but left their tents and stoves in their established bivouac site. However, they did not immediately occupy the designated position atop East Hill. At this point, Dog Company consisted of 3 officers, a warrant officer, 77 enlisted men, and 90 men from the Katyusha, or the Korean augmentation to the United States Army. The relationship with the Katyusha troops was stronger than most, as they had been integrated into the company almost 2 months before the embarkation in Japan. This contrasts significantly with the US troops in the company, as many had arrived to the unit just days before boarding ships in Japan to head to Korea. Along with the individual weapons, the company had 4 50 caliber machine guns, 5 30 caliber machine guns, and 6 3.5-inch rocket launchers. The company lacked mortars and recoilless weapons. Each soldier was issued 3 units of fire, which was around 288 rounds of ammunition for the M1 rifle, 2 grenades, and all of the machine gun ammo and rockets they could carry. The weight made the movements at the top of East Hill challenging and slow, but it wasn't until after dark that Dog Company reached its positions. The existing positions weren't particularly organized, and it wasn't possible to establish a final protective line in the dark. The company set in with the 1st platoon on the right, just below the crest of the hill, 2nd in the middle, and 3rd, which was Bob's platoon, on the left. Their headquarters faced the rear, and the CO, along with a Marine liaison officer, were in the center of this perimeter. Though the company had its full allotment of radios, as many of us here can attest to, communications were poor. And while Bob couldn't contact his CO, he did at least have communications with the Marine officer at the CO's position. A Marine officer had been assigned to act as both an advisor and a liaison for the engineers, as they were not an infantry unit. After setting in his squads, Bob went to tie in with the Signal Corps platoon on the left, only to find that it was a Katyusha labor platoon being led by an American captain instead. Coordinating fires were planned, and Bob returned to his platoon. The map on the left is the most commonly used map in most historical accounts of the Battle of Choisin Reservoir, denoting positions around Hagaruri and East Hill. The interesting thing to note is that this map also puts the engineers and the platoon from 4th Signal inversed, with the platoon from 4th Signal all the way at the edge of the hill. But as no one who was there helped make that map, we now know that the map on the right is probably the most accurate one to exist, showing the displacement of the troops from Dog Company as 1st, 2nd, and 3rd respectively, overlooking East Hill with the Marine roadblock below them. The company was in position by 2030, and around 2200 they began to hear firing nearby. About 30 minutes later, it became evident that the enemy had cut through the Katyusha platoon and was now beginning to envelop Dog Company, attacking from the left and rear of their position. Bob's platoon was the first in the company to become engaged, and it quickly became evident that it was necessary to reface the squads. Though the men were untrained for such a maneuver, Bob rotated his front 90 degrees to face the incoming enemy, losing most of his left squad in the process. Through the night, the company held fast. The 3rd platoon and 2nd both had to withdraw approximately 250 yards. At various points, troops ended up fighting on the forward slope of the hill as well as the top, having been dislodged by the explosions from incoming fire. By 0300, all 4 platoons had formed a tight perimeter at the crest of East Hill, which became problematic once the company began to receive heavy shelling by white phosphorus rounds. Throughout the night, the enemy launched a great number of banzai-type attacks. The engineers countered with everything they had, depleting most of the rifle and machine gun ammunition they had carried up the hill, and even firing rockets point blank at the enemy troops. An attack would be repelled, things would calm briefly, and then another wave of 25 to 30 enemy troops would assault. Despite the earlier integration of the Katyusha troops into the company, it had been found they didn't perform to the expected standards. Communication with them was difficult, and despite their insistence that they had no ammunition to spare during the battle, it was found in the weeks after that most had never fired a shot and were still carrying their initial allotment. At the beginning of the fight, Dog Company experienced many weapons malfunctions and sluggish performance due to the cold, a problem experienced by many of the US forces during the battle. In some cases, the soldiers picked up enemy weapons, many of which happened to be US Thompsons and carbines. Dog Company was ordered to hold their position throughout the night as there was no support to be offered. During the fighting, their liaison officer was killed, but not before communicating the severity of their situation to the division headquarters. Around dawn, a composite force of approximately 100 Marines from rear echelon forces such as cooks and mechanics arrived at East Hill to reinforce Dog Company. And at 0900, an airstrike to their immediate front proved to be a great help. Airstrikes from sailors and Marines would persist throughout, as well as our UN allied forces. At one point, an Australian pilot was noted to have run out of ammunition for the machine guns on his airplane and proceeded to buzz the enemy troops on nearby hillsides, utilizing his propeller to scare them off and help break up attacks. Finally, around 1200 on the 29th, Dog Company was relieved of their position, and some of their troops were shifted to the west side of the perimeter at Hagaruri, where they would remain until the breakout. Dog Company losses were almost 50% that night. Casualties being 2 officers slightly wounded, 23 men wounded, 10 killed, 9 missing, and 50 Katyusha troops killed, wounded, or missing. These losses were amplified by the key personnel loss: the supply sergeant, 2 cooks, 2 radio operators killed, the first sergeant, a platoon sergeant, and an assistant platoon sergeant, an RO, and 2 cooks wounded, and a platoon sergeant and 2 squad leaders missing. Before the breakout could begin, they had to wait for the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments in the northwest side and Task Force Base on the east side of the reservoir. In addition to continuing their duties along the perimeter, they were finally utilized again as engineers, doing such tasks as disarming dud rounds that had landed within the perimeter and checking the dead sappers for traps. They also helped to feed the incoming Marines and soldiers who were returning to the perimeter since they had left their kitchen intact. Breakout from Hagaruri would begin on the 6th of December once all the remaining UN troops had consolidated at the Hagaruri perimeter. The column of troops and vehicles stretched out for miles, and during the breakout, Dog Company was near the back of the evacuation formation for its entirety. There was scattered fighting throughout the breakout, and Dog Company arrived at the town of Kodori on the night of the 7th, almost 24 hours after the breakout had started. Here, the 1st Marine Division and other UN forces made their final consolidation before making the movement to the port at Hungnam for evacuation to South Korea. The 3rd Infantry Division had created a large perimeter around the town of Hungnam, extending almost 34 miles inland, with the friendly troops beginning to arrive in this perimeter on the 11th of December. Bob would spend most of his time walking during the breakout, having given up the Jeep I showed earlier so that wounded could be better evacuated. As the perimeter around Hungnam shrank, artillery and tanks became ineffective, and the battleship the USS Missouri assisted in protecting the troops within the perimeter, lobbing 16-inch main gun rounds inland. Upon arrival, Dog Company was reintegrated back to the 3rd Infantry Division. While the Marines were some of the first to be evacuated, because they had now gone back to the Army, they would be amongst the last. In the final 24 hours at Hungnam, Bob rescued a soldier from a minefield. Years later, when we asked him why, he simply said he had laid the mines, so he knew where they all were. The engineers who stayed behind would help to rig everything that had to stay for detonation. This included vehicles, supplies, and the docks themselves at Hungnam. They were finally able to evacuate from Hungnam on the morning of the 24th, Christmas Eve, 1950, almost 2 weeks after having arrived at the perimeter. The evacuation would essentially be the amphibious landing in reverse, utilizing Higgins boats to bring them back out to ships that would ferry them south. The map here shows the route south back, and as you can see, the PLA markings along the sides are for enemy troops that were harassing the UN column all the way south. And the picture on the bottom right is pretty famous. Sue asked if I could mention it. It's the bridge at Kodori, and it was blown up during the evacuation. This bridge would be repaired utilizing the Marine engineers, since they were at the front of the column. And this bridge was repaired using spans that were dropped by the newly minted Air Force's C-19 boxcars. They dropped several bridge spans nearby that were then put into place. On the left is the back of a book written by one of the soldiers in Bob's company, at the time private. He retired as a major, Frank Kessner. And the picture on the bottom is one of the trucks that their company had, D-21. When it made it all the way to the evacuation point, they counted over 170 bullet holes throughout the vehicle, but the truck was still running. And then, of course, most famously on the right is the explosion of the docks at Hungnam once it was rigged for detonation. Critical tactical errors made by the Chinese troops gave the UN forces a large advantage, chiefly that they had left access to the runway at Hagaruri that was capable of supporting C-47s. This runway was under construction when Dog Company arrived. It was a Marine Corps project, and the fact that they were able to complete that runway allowed the resupply of critical things like fuel, ammunition, and replacement troops while facilitating the mass evacuations of the wounded. It was estimated that Dog Company had been hit by an enemy battalion of approximately 1,000, and they counted more than 400 bodies of Chinese troops in front of their position at daylight on the 29th. This was a surprise to them, as the Chinese weren't believed to be involved yet, and especially not in such numbers. One of the criteria for not proceeding further north was that Chinese or Russian involvement had not happened yet in North Korea. And at the time, very, very small numbers of Chinese troops had been encountered, typically from different division numbers. And so US intelligence believed there was no way that that many different divisions had crossed the border without their knowledge. Unfortunately, the Chinese had crossed in large enough numbers to rout a US Army division just prior to their attack at Choisin, but we didn't know that in time. No account has been taken of the lack of experience or that they were suddenly thrust into combat role with no orientation or support. And it would take months before the Marines would even credit the soldiers of Dog Company as having been within their perimeter. Morning reports from much of the battle were lost, further leading to a great deal of the confusion, as an adequate record was difficult to produce, indicating the whereabouts and conditions of the members of Dog Company. The Marines were often critical of Dog Company for its operations on the night of 28 and 29 November, in spite of the company holding its position. In years after, someone described the Marines as having to go up the hill to rescue the soldiers on East Hill, while simultaneously also saying that the soldiers had broken and ran down the hill. Two very different and competing ideas. Decades later, historians remain critical of the Army on both sides of the reservoir, despite updates in records and accounts, including award citations. The release of the book East of Choisin in 1990 would finally begin to correct this, helping change the narrative that the Army at Choisin had been cowards. On 15 January 1951, my grandfather was awarded the Silver Star for his actions at Choisin. On 28 November 1950, near Hagaruri, Korea, during an enemy attack on his platoon's position, Lieutenant Rosen repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to throw hand grenades and point out targets for his platoon. After a forced withdrawal to new positions, Lieutenant Rosen discovered that his radio operator had been wounded and remained in the evacuated position. Under a heavy concentration of enemy fire, Lieutenant Rosen succeeded in reaching the wounded man and returning him to safety. His heroic actions and display of aggressive leadership were an inspiration to his men that stiffened their resistance to the enemy. The gallantry displayed by Lieutenant Rosen reflects great credit upon himself and upon the military service. Award recipients from the battle were held up to be returned to stateside together with fanfare to help boost support for the war. Unfortunately, by the time this all happened, it was too late, and by the time these service members were returned to the United States collectively, the opinion had already changed for how we supported what was happening in Korea. Bob's brother, my great uncle Joel, would go on to enlist in the Marines, having heard the stories and hoping to go save his big brother. This wouldn't happen, and he would spend the entire duration of the Korean War stationed at Treasure Island Naval Base just outside of San Francisco. After the war, my grandfather would return to Korea in 1963 to serve as the battalion commander of the 13th Engineer Battalion. He would go on to serve at the NATO headquarters in Europe in the mid-1960s, helping to facilitate the move of NATO's headquarters from Paris, France to Belgium when de Gaulle kicked NATO out of France. In 69 and 70, he would serve in Vietnam, helping construct many of the roadways that were utilized. We joked he got one of his Legions of Merits for constructing the roads, and the NVA should have given him another medal since they used the roads themselves. And then he would continue to be a strong supporter of West Point, including becoming an advocate for women being admitted to the academy during the 1980s. While he didn't talk about it much, he certainly wasn't shy about sharing his experiences. In 1955, his short article, Combat Comes Suddenly, was published in the book Combat Support in Korea, which was a collection of reflections and lessons learned, and a great deal of which I use today. In his office, he had a framed picture of the reservoir in significantly nicer weather than that which he saw, that included tubes with the water and sand from the reservoir that had been collected once Americans were able to go back into North Korea decades after. This hung on his wall in his office next to the shadow box that held all of his awards and badges from his service, to include a Silver Star. On his desk sat his bayonet from the battle, which had found new life as a letter opener. The tip had been shot off as it had exited the foxhole before he did, or at least that's what I was told. In the early 2000s, my cousin's 8th grade history class was learning about Korea, and her teacher said that only the Marines had been present at Choisin. She argued, as she always does, saying that the Army was there, and this led to a debate until she said her grandfather had been there, and he was in the Army. In coat and tie, and with slides in hand, Bob presented to my cousin's 8th grade history class all about the Choisin Reservoir. On occasions where he would wear a coat, he often adorned it with a Silver Star lapel pin. During high school, after dinner one night when my grandparents were visiting, I asked Bob a question about his time in Korea. I couldn't tell you what it was, but what I got was his retelling of the events from the landing at Wonsan to the evacuation at Hungnam. My mom would tell me afterwards that that was the only time she'd ever heard that story. Soon after, we're playing a board game that featured miniature replicas of World War II equipment, one of which was the Quad 50 anti-aircraft gun, just like the one displayed on top of the half-track in the second hangar of the museum. He made a comment that they worked well against massed infantry. As a high school student, that didn't really mean much, but as an infantry Marine, my understanding of my grandfather changed significantly looking back on that moment. My grandfather and my grandmother are both now buried at Arlington, sharing their section with many other fine individuals, to include John Glenn. Thank you.
Are there any questions? That was so incredibly interesting. Thank you. And thank you for honoring your grandfather here at the Warhawk. I want to give you a coin. So thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. Great job. Okay, thanks.